Chapter 6 of Behavioral Neuroscience starts with the evolution of brain and behavior. The first segment speaks about all ideas that we've all encountered at one point in our lives, which is natural selection, evolution, Darwinism, sexual selection, adaptation, and whatnot. The first page, where they always have the little story, basically, roughly, that made no sense. Basically talks about how our closest relatives are chimpanzees and our genetic materials differs by 1.2%. It also points out variations between us, how chimps walk on four, we walk on two. Humans have complex languages, while chimps have sounds. The next page, 158, talks about naturalist Darwin and how all our ideas came to be. The first thing is a naturalist is a student of forms and classifications of all organisms. The naturalists believe that animals were built on modifications for a very specific plan to survive, which makes a lot of sense, because how else are you going to survive if you don't know how they're modified in the proper way? It also brings into idea Darwin, which makes, the idea of a naturalist make more sense. At least to me it did. Darwin and Alfred Wallace both had ideas of how the evolution of natural selection occurred. Darwin thought about this idea for 20 years, while Wallace had a fever, shot up out of bed, and said, "Hey, this is what it is." While they were on the HMS Beagle, the governor of the Galapagos pointed out that if you go from island to island, the tortoises have different shells. And then Darwin started noticing that the finches, their beakers, were suited differently. Darwin speculated that birds were descendants from one species and gradually diverged to adapt to the area. In 1859, he published a book on the origins of species by means of natural selection. It basically points out 4 points. Reproduction will tend to increase a population rapidly unless factors limit it. Individuals of a given species are not identical, and some of the variations among individuals is inherited. And lastly, not all offsprings of a given generation will survive to reproduce. The next thing is adaptation, which is a trait that increases the probability of surviving. And if that trait continues getting passed on, there is more success in reproduction, which is an increase to population, which Darwin was just speaking about in his book. Darwin also believes that there is also a psychological function to surviving, as well as the evolution of organs, which I did not know, which is very unique because I never thought of, organs, evolving properly, not realizing that the mind has to do the exact same thing to survive. The next point they bring up is sexual selection. It apparently says that the evolution of anatomical and behavioral differences between male and female allow for reproductive success. The next idea on page 159 is evolution may converge on similar solutions. It says that adaptation to an ecological feature may bring similarities in behavior or structure, which is convergent evolution. So it points out a little example, which is the bodies of tuna fish and dolphins. They resemble one another because of the efficient swimming they have to do. And it gives you 2 ideas. It says homoplasy, which is physical resemblance based on common ancestry, which is like the humans and the chimpanzees. And it says analogy, which is structures that may look different but have similar features. So, all our arms may look different, but they all have somewhat similar features. The modern evolutionary theory combines natural selection and genetics. There was a giant gap in Darwin's study, and Mendel and Verries came up with the idea. So Mendel came up with, the Punnett squares, and was able to fill in recessive and dominant genes, and Verries conducted an experiment. And with that experiment, we now know the idea of mutations, which is a change in a nucleotide sequence as a result of an unfaithful replication. It occurs spontaneously and randomly because of the genes. Mutations are heritable, and sometimes scientists deliberately input mutations to see what would happen, whether they would be neutral, beneficial, or harmful. If it's beneficial, it's called conspecific, which is more widespread in every generation. And then genetics is the study of inheritance, including genes encoded in the DNA. And he speaks about this, I believe it's a fruit fly. I don't know how to pronounce the name, and I'm not going to try. And its generation is 10 days, which makes it very easy to study something in such a short amount of time, because you can't study human beings because our generation is clearly longer than 10 days. And they say that the salivary glands produce giant chromosomes, which can be seen in a microscope, and that's how they study, the condensed strands of DNA, the protein molecules inside the nucleus, which contains the genes. The next idea is how closely related are two species. There's a system that was proposed in the mnemonic devices, please put clothes on for God's goodness sakes. And it's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And that's how we categorize everybody and everything. So if you all have vertebrae, you're all chordata, but you're not the same species. Get that? The next idea is taxidermy, which is classification of organisms. I do believe that everyone should take a look at figure 6.3 on page 161. I don't think it's going to be on the quiz, but I do think it's an idea that we should all have incorporated in our heads. They also bring up the idea of DNA, how it may estimate, it says estimates from DNA and fossils aren't always accurate with the evolutionary tree, and that molecular dates are too old for calibrating DNA. And the last few things is, why should we study other species? We should study other species because humans picture animals as incomplete little humans, which I think is very pompous of us, because we think not everything is a little human. We also believe that there's a linear descent, which is the idea that evolution has proceeded along simple trajectory from simple to complex. There's ecological niches, a unique assortment of environmental opportunities and challenges for which animals are adapted to. So an anteater's long face and tongue allows it to eat ants in like cracks and crevices, while, my hand trying to get an ant is very difficult. It also talks about how species have to adapt. They have certain things that they have to adapt to in order to survive, which is, being able to pay attention to danger and finding food. Because if you avoid danger, you live longer. And if you eat well, you live longer. And if you live longer, you can reproduce, which continues for the population's growth. Also, on page 163, which is the last page, it talks about why should we study particular species, and it goes through 6 points, which is outstanding features, convenience, comparison, preservation, economic importance, and the treatments of diseases, which I do believe some of that will be on the quiz. So, good luck.